everyone, and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be going over 5 cards from the new set Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate that are kind of confusing on first read and many players have misinterpreted them. Let's begin. Up first is Alaundo the Seer. It's a legendary creature for 2 and Simic 3/5 human summon. And the ability is just activate ability, it's tap, draw a card, then exile a card from your hand, and put a number of time counters on it equal to its mana value. It gains when the last counter is removed from this card. If it's exiled, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. If you cast a creature spell away, it gains haste until end of turn. Then remove a time counter from its other card you own in exile. So you might be familiar with this from Joy of the Gitu. It's kind of similar, but it's not at all the same. The difference here is, other than the effect that Joyra puts the card with 4 counters and Alaundo puts with counters on equal to the mana cost, is that Joyra also keeps the card suspend. And why that's important is because part of the suspend mechanic is removing one time counter during your upkeep. And that's what Joyra does. So with Joyra you know that once you suspend the card with her ability, after 4 turns have passed, you get the card. With Alaundo it's a little bit different, because the counters on the card you exile are not removed automatically during your upkeep, and they can only be removed by Alaundo's ability or that cards that specifically remove time counters, like Clocksmithing. So if you were to exile, for example, a 10 drop like a Nulla Monk, you would face a problem because you wouldn't have 4 turns or even 10 turns to wait for Nulla Monk. You need to actually activate Alaundo 10 more times, which may be even impossible even for a commander game unless you have ways to untap him. Also, that's like a very slight difference from Suspend. Suspend gave the creature haste indefinitely. This gives the creature haste till the end of the turn, but it doesn't really matter. At least you can remove counters in other ways than Alaundo's ability, because the ability gauges when the last counter is removed, not when the last counter is removed with Alaundo's ability. And also, the first card you exile with Alaundo won't remove a counter. And let's say you have exiled a card with Alaundo, then we use its ability again, then we only remove counters from the other cards because say other cards. So it's a really slow engine, and even though it seems similar to Joyra, they're actually very different both in speed and in function. Also, another interesting thing here is that actually Alaundo works with cards that have suspend already, because if you have suspended the card, that means that the second ability of Alaundo will actually remove time counters from cards in exile, even though they are not exiled from Alaundo's ability. So you can use him as a speed up for your suspend cards. And also be very careful with cards like Ancestral Visions that have no mana cost, because if you exile them with Alaundo's ability, then they would be exiled with 0 time counters, and because they have no counter to remove, they can never be cast from exile, because you need to remove at least one counter, which will be the last counter for the card to be cast. But it works fine if you suspend Ancestral Vision normally, and then use Alaundo to shorten the time you need to get to the visions. Next we have Baba Lysaga Night Witch. It's a legendary creature human warlock, 3/3 for 1 and Bulgari colors, and the ability tap, sacrifice up to 3 permanents. If there were 3 or more card types among the sacrificed permanents, each one loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. So notably here, the tap and sacrificing is all part of the cost, so your opponents can only respond while you activate that ability until the ability is placed on the stack, so you'll be able to sacrifice anything you want without the opponent having an option to removing the thing you try to sacrifice. It doesn't say other permanents, so you can sacrifice Baba Lysaga itself. And interestingly, it says up to 3, so you could sacrifice 0 things just to tap here, even though it doesn't do technically anything. The ability still goes on the stack, it does nothing. Now, the reason it says up to 3 permanents, and also notice it doesn't say non-land, so you can sacrifice lands with your ability, is that you don't have to sacrifice 3 permanents to get the effect, you just have to have 3 or more card types among the sacrifice permanents. Now, how do we achieve that? Well, it's pretty difficult to do it all at once, because you will need something that's a land creature artifact, for example. But you could do it from the Whip of Erebos, for example, because it's already a legendary artifact enchantment. If you use March of the Machines or Opalescence to turn it into a creature, you can just sacrifice it and you get the ability. Now that's not very realistic to happen. So usually what will happen is that you find a creature that also has an enchantment or artifact type and sacrifice it along with another permanent that has a different type. So the types of permanents obviously are 8, which include instant and sorceries, so the permanents actually only have 6 different creature types, and tribal is a little bit iffy. But you can do very nice stuff with it, like you can sacrifice Lysaga, which has as an enchantment in the land that you need like a creature. You could also animate your lands who have land creatures and then sacrifice it. One really neat thing I think you should consider here, because it's kind of cheeky and easy to do. If you pay auras that are rancor that return from the graveyard when they put there from the field, you essentially can sacrifice both the creature they are on and the aura, because they sacrifice the permanents at the same time. And so you can get the rancor back and have like a 2-for-1 deal in that situation. So pretty interesting. Just remember that you can choose what you sacrifice. You don't need to get the ability to sacrifice the things. So if you would just to use the ability to sacrifice after, you can. Up next we have Dynaheir, Invoker, Adept. It's a legendary creature human wizard 4/4 for 1 in Jeskai colors. It has haste. You may activate abilities of other creatures you control as though they had haste. And whenever your next activate an ability this turn by spending 4 or more mana to activate, you copy that. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, this card will receive a slight errata, which technically does not need, but it would be confusing otherwise, because people thought that this could copy the ability of Cascading Cataracts that you use mana to get Wuborg, and you could get essentially double the mana. But unfortunately, this would be errated to set active non-mana ability. And mana abilities technically cannot be copied, because even though you can copy stuff like that, you can only copy objects, and mana ability, because it doesn't use a stack, it's not really an object in the game, so it cannot be copied, but you think it will be able to be copied. So this card will be changed to not being able to target mana abilities. And also the second ability does need, like, it just looks for the next time in the turn you will spend 4 or more mana to activate an ability. Also not because it's activate ability, it means activate ability, so even though you could have a triggered ability that could want you to pay mana to activate it or resolve it, which is the most correct presence, you won't be able to copy that ability. It's overall a pretty interesting commander, and you will need to look for things that have an activate ability that costs a lot of mana, so you can get it twice. But the part that essentially creatures with activate abilities have haste will also include mana abilities from creatures. Now there are not that many mana drops in Jeskai colors, but there are some. So you could use it there, but you cannot use the second ability to copy mana abilities, and that's where the most of the confusion got from. So you need to spend 4 or more mana to activate an ability to be able to copy it, and that ability must not be a mana ability, so have fun searching ways you can use that ability. Up next we have Myrkul, Lord of Bones. It's a legendary creature god, 7/5 for 4 and absent colors. As long as your life total is less than or equal to half your starting life total, Myrkul, Lord of Bones, has indestructible, so that's a play on the indestructibility of gods, and here you can get it essentially when you are dying. And whenever another creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except its enchantment and loses all other card types. So this card is super interesting. And you might think, okay, it's pretty simple, you essentially make your creatures into enchantments, but there's actually more of a simple line to that. Let's look at it. So for the indestructibility part, you just look at what game you're playing. In a regular 20 life game, that means that you have to have 10 or less life. In Commander, that means that you need to have 20 or less life. Now, if you're in a game mode that has an odd number for starting life total, let's say, for example, you start at 25, well, 25, half of that is 12.5. So if you're on 12 life, this will have destructible. If you're on 13 life, this won't have destructible. You don't get the equal, but you can the between. Now, for the other parts of the text. So first things first, this triggered ability resolves other ones. There is not a when you do, so it's not a reflexive trigger. So let's say a creature I control died. This triggers, when the trigger resolves, I choose to exile and then I create a token at that time. Also, it's a copy of the card except, and when we see copy of a card except, that means it's all part of the copy effect. And the except here is pretty interesting because it just makes the card an enchantment and not any other card type, which is like kind of like Imposter Mech, which created some weird rulings. So why this is interesting? So when a creature dies and it has an enchantment, obviously it will not have a power toughness because it's no longer a creature, even though it has a pretty power toughness on it. But thinking about creatures is the low way to abuse this card. We can do all sorts of stuff. Let's say we play planeswalkers that could turn to creatures like Gideons, or we use the Luxor, the user that makes the creatures, the planeswalkers into creatures, and then they die. What happens? Well, this is very interesting because this will look at a non-token creature dying. When we reference die, we look at the card that existed in the battlefield. So since the planeswalker on the battlefield was a creature, that means that it's valid for Myrkul's ability. So we can exile the planeswalker and create an enchantment copy of that planeswalker. Now, what that means is that, you know, planeswalkers usually enter with loyalty counters. Actually, always enter with loyalty counters based on the loyalty number on the side. That's an intrinsic ability of the planeswalker, and here we create an enchantment. So even though we have a copy of our planeswalker that's not a legendary planeswalker now, but it's a legendary enchantment, and yes, it remains legendary because this except does not affect super types. That means that we get a planeswalker, but we have 0 loyalty counters. But we still get to activate their loyalty abilities as normal. So this is pretty interesting, and if it's even a planeswalker that would turn into a creature by himself, it would actually turn again into a creature. Now, because we exile the card, this is a token, we do not get, if the planeswalker dies again, make another token of it. Also, another very interesting fact, if you manage to animate artifacts or enchantments and they become creatures, they return. So Opalescence is funny here because it will make everything into an enchantment, and then when it dies it will return again as an enchantment and it will become a creature thanks to Opalescence. Obviously that's not infinite again because it's a token and then we cannot return the card back. Lands are interesting, you need to be very careful because the thing that makes basic lands tap on mana is that they're basic and they have a subtype. And when they are not Logier lands, you have basic enchantments that do nothing. So be very careful. This commander is meant to be used with creatures with activate abilities and obviously goes infinite with Devoted Druid really easily too, because the enchantment that it has does not have summoning sickness, so you can use it to tap for mana, put a -1 mana counter on it, and then guess what? You had -1 counter on something that's not the creature, so you don't care. So you can use it and Devoted Druid to get infinite mana really easily, and then you could play like a Quaking Ballista, which will die immediately, return as an enchantment that could use its effect to just store up +1/+1 counters and then shoot the opponents to death. Very interesting command, you can go a lot of ways with it. I'm excited to see what people build with this. The final card is not the legendary creature card, it's one of the last cards that were spoiled. It's Sculpted Sunburst. It's 3 and double white for a sorcery. Choose a creature you control, then each opponent chooses a creature they control with equal or lesser power. If you choose a creature this way, exile each creature not chosen by any other player this way. So this card is a little bit confusing, like Ragrita was in New Capenna. Why it is worded that way if you choose and stuff. So, first things first, let's get out of the way. This card does not target. You just play it. You can play it even without having any creatures. Now, you probably don't want to do that because, you see, if you have no creatures, you didn't choose a creature. So if you choose a creature this way, part does not apply, and this card does absolutely nothing. The reason it is worded this way instead of targeting is twofold. If you have to target a creature you control and an opponent remove that creature, the whole spell would fizzle because it's a spell with a target, and when a spell with a target loses all of its available targets, the spell is put into the graveyard from the stack. And the other reason it's worded this way is if you have multiple creatures and your opponents kill one or two of them, as long as you still have at least one creature remaining, this card will do something. So essentially what this means is that you choose one creature you have that has a certain amount of power. If you choose a 0 power creature, then each opponent will have to choose a creature with 0 or less power, which means essentially 0 power, and then they will exile all other creatures not chosen. So pretty interesting. Note that the opponents have to choose a creature they control, so they cannot essentially help one player to keep all of their creatures. And you don't have to have creatures for the opponents to choose in order for this ability to resolve. So if a player has no creatures with equal or less power than the creature you chose, it will exile all of the creatures. So this card is good in decks that have creatures with low power but high impact effects, so like a wall deck like Arcadis, for example. And these were the cards that spiked a little bit of conversation among the community and were pretty confusing when they first appeared, but if you sit down and break them down a little bit, you can make sense of what they do. Now, whether that's an issue with game designing or with rules, that's up to debate, but I hope you understood what the cards did. This is a more complicated set because it's meant to be not a standard set, so it has some more tricky and niche interactions. It's not quite like the other Commander Legends set, which was also confusing in some parts. Hope you all learned something today. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.